The engines arrived before the sun did. Walter Brandt heard them from the kitchen, a low rolling thunder that came down the county road and did not fade the way trucks faded. It built. It grew teeth. By the time he reached the porch, with his coffee going cold in his hand, the headlights were already turning off the blacktop and onto his gravel drive, two abreast, then four, a river of chrome and black leather, flooding the yard he had walked alone for 9 years. He counted past 30 and stopped counting. He set the mug on the railing. His heart was a fist against his ribs. And he was 71 years old, and he had no idea whether these men had come to thank him or to bury him. The dust they raised hung gold in the first light. Walter stood very still. A man does not run at 71, and Walter would not have run at any age, but the stillness cost him. His knees had been bad since the second knee replacement failed, and standing took effort. Now took a planted will. He planted it. The lead riders cut their engines one by one, and the silence that dropped over the farm after all that noise was its own kind of pressure, heavy and total, the way silence gets right before a storm decides what it is going to do. He did not know yet that the man climbing off the front bike had been counting the days until this morning for almost a year. He did not know that the favor he had done last autumn, the favor he had already half forgotten, had traveled farther than he could imagine. He only knew that his fields were behind him, unharvested, the corn standing brown and ready, and far too much for one old man and a tractor with a slipping clutch. He knew the bank's letter was on the kitchen table. He knew this was the worst possible week for 30 strangers to ride into his life. Pull the clock back 1 year, to the autumn before, and you find Walter the way most people found him in those days, which is to say you did not find him at all. He kept to the farm. The farm was 420 acres of corn and soy outside a town called Halford, in the flat middle of the country. And it had been his father's and his grandfather's, and Walter had given it everything a man has to give. He had been born in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse. He had learned to drive a tractor before he learned to drive a car, sitting in his father's lap with his small hands on the wheel and his father's big hands over them. He had buried his parents from that farm and married Eleanor on the lawn. Behind it under a tent the neighbors raised, and 43 years had passed away. Years pass on the land. In seasons rather than dates, in plantings and harvests, and the long-held breath of winter in between. His wife, Eleanor, had died in the spring of that year, 43 years married, and then a stroke in the night, quiet with no warning and no chance to say the things a man saves up, assuming there will always be time. He had woken beside her and known, before he was fully awake, that the quality of the stillness was wrong. Then a house that held her in every room and her nowhere in it, her reading glasses still folded on the windowsill, her handwriting still on the calendar in the kitchen, marking the dates of things that would now never happen. Their son had moved to the coast a long time ago, chasing a life that had no room in it for corn and soy, and he called on Sundays when he remembered, and the calls were short and careful and full of the things people say when they have run out of the things they mean. Walter farmed. There was nothing else left that he knew how to do, and the work was a mercy, because the work did not ask him how he was holding up. The work only asked to be done. The diner on Route 9 was the one indulgence he allowed himself. A cup of coffee on the mornings. The loneliness in the kitchen got too loud to sit inside of. It was a low cinder block place with a buzzing neon sign that read H. Hay Ep Ford Eats, the second E gone dark for as long as anyone could remember, so that at night it spelled out HALFORD HS to the empty highway. Inside, it smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee, and the particular vinyl smell of booths older than some of the people who sat in them. Walter took the corner booth, the one with a view of the road, the one Eleanor used to take when she came with him in the years before her knees went the way his had gone now. He nodded to Dolores, who ran the register and had run it since before Eleanor passed, and he drank his coffee slow, and he watched the road. That was the morning the bikes came the first time. Not 30 of them all at once. Just one tired pack of riders a long way from anywhere pulling in off the highway with the look of men who had been on the road too long and were running on fumes and goodwill, neither of which lasts. There were a dozen of them that first day, then more trickling in over the next hour, and by mid-morning the gravel lot held closer to 30 motorcycles parked in rough rows, the chrome catching the flat autumn sun. They wore black leather cuts with a patch Walter did not recognize, a winged skull over the words Iron Covenant, and below it a rocker that named a chapter from 3 states east. They were not local. They came in by 2s and 3s, ducking under the low doorway, and they filled the diner with the smell of road and exhaust and old leather, a smell that did not belong in a place that usually smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee. They were polite in the careful way of men who knew exactly how much room they took up in a small place and did not want trouble. They took off their gloves. They said please and thank you to Dolores in low voices. One of them, a young rider with a sunburned neck, held the door for an elderly couple on their way out and said, "Ma'am," to the wife, and the wife smiled at him before she remembered to be afraid. But Walter watched Dolores's face go tight. He watched her count heads and count her stock in the same anxious glance, the math of a small business running behind her eyes. She had 24 eggs in the cooler and a single hand on the grill, which was her because the morning girl had called in sick. She wiped her hands on her apron more than the wiping needed. Walter had known Dolores for 30 years, and he could read the worry on her, the way he could read weather coming over the fields, and the worry was not fear of these men exactly. It was the older, deeper fear of a person who lives close to the edge of her accounts and has just watched 30 mouths walk through her door with no certainty that any of them could pay. The trouble was simple, and it was money. The man who seemed to lead them, a heavy-set rider with a gray-streaked beard and a brace on one wrist, came to the register with his card, and the card did not go through. He tried another. That one failed, too. There had been a problem at a station 2 days back, he explained quietly. A fraud hold the bank had frozen everything while they sorted it. And he was good for it. He swore he was good for it. But right now he had $11 in cash and a room full of men who had not eaten a real meal since the day before yesterday. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a single threat. He just stood there with his dead card in his hand, and the particular shame of a proud man who cannot pay. Dolores looked at the dining room. 30 hungry men, and a register that needed to make rent. She started to say the thing. She had to say the no that her business required, and Walter watched the leader nod before she finished it, already turning, already gathering his men to leave Hungary and ride on. Men. And Walter, who had spoken to almost no one in the 6 months since Eleanor died, heard himself say, "Put it on my tab." The whole room turned. Dolores blinked at him. Walter set down his coffee and stood slow, his knees announcing themselves, and he walked to the register. And he said it again so there could be no mistake. "Whatever they want. Put it on my tab. I'll settle it before I leave." He was not a wealthy man. He had maybe $200 in his account that he could touch without the bank noticing, and he knew, doing the arithmetic even as he spoke, that feeding 30 men would eat most of it. He did it anyway. Eleanor would have done it. Eleanor fed anyone who came to the door, always had, and the kitchen had been silent of her cooking for 6 months, and something in Walter could not watch 30 tired men turned away hungry while he had the means, barely, to keep that from happening. The leader looked at him for a long moment. He was a man who read people for a living. You could see it. And he was reading Walter now and finding something he had not expected. "You don't know us," he said. His voice was a low gravel rumble, the kind that carried without effort. "I know you're hungry," Walter said. "Sit down, eat." They called the leader, Briggs. Walter learned that much over the next 2 hours, while the diner filled with the sound of forks and low talk, and Dolores ran her grill harder than she had run it in years. Briggs sat across from Walter in the corner booth, and they did not talk about much. The weather, the roads east, the price of diesel. Briggs ate a plate of eggs and a stack of pancakes, and he watched Walter the whole time with those reading eyes. And near the end he asked, careful, "Why'd you do it?" Walter turned his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table. "My wife used to say that a hungry man at your door. Is the Lord asking you a question?" He had not meant to say her name's worth of weight out loud, and he heard it land, and he looked out the window. So he would not have to look at the biker's face. She passed in the spring. "I reckon I'm just answering the question the way she'd want." Briggs did not say he was sorry. He did not offer a single soft word, and Walter was grateful for it, because soft words had become unbearable in the spring, when the whole town said them, and none of them brought Eleanor back. Briggs just nodded, slow, like a man filing something away in a place he would not lose it. When the meal was done, the bill came to $184, and Walter paid it in full, and it left him with $16 to his name until the harvest came in. He did not tell Briggs that part. He shook the man's hand, and the hand swallowed his, and he drove his old truck home, and did not think about it much. After that, a favor was a favor. You did not do it to be repaid. Eleanor had taught him that too. The autumn turned cold. Walter brought in what he could of the harvest alone, and it was not enough, and he knew it was not enough, even as he ran the combine into the dark each night, with his bad knees screaming and the slipping clutch grabbing and letting go. The price of corn had cratered. The cost of everything else had not. He had borrowed against the next year's crop 2 years running, the way a man bails a sinking boat, and the bank in town that held the note had been bought by a larger bank, and the larger bank did not know him, did not know his father or his grandfather, did not care that 4 generations of Brants were buried in the churchyard on the hill. The larger bank knew only the number, and the number was bad. The man who carried the number had a name, and the name was Garrett Vance. He was the regional asset manager for the bank that had eaten the bank that had held Walter's note, and he drove a German sedan the color of a gun, and he wore suits that cost more than Walter's combine was worth at auction. He came out to the farm in October, the autumn after the diner, and he stood in the yard in his polished shoes and looked at the standing corn the way a butcher looks at a steer. He picked his way across the gravel, carefully lifting each foot as though the ground itself might soil him, and Walter, watching from the porch, understood that this was a man who had never in his life done a day's work that left a mark on his hands. He did not shake Walter's hand. He set a slim leather folder on the hood of his car and opened it, and the folder had Walter's whole life reduced to columns, the acreage and the balance and the dates and the penalties, laid out in clean printed rows with the cold patience of a man who had done this many times and felt nothing. "The note is in default, Mr. Brant," Vance said. "Has been for 60 days. The institution has been more than patient." He used words like institution and patient the way other men used weapons, smooth and practiced and impossible to argue with. We're prepared to begin foreclosure proceedings at the end of the harvest window, unless, of course, you'd prefer to sell now and avoid the legal expense. I have a buyer who'd take the whole parcel as is cash, a clean closing. You'd walk away with something in your pocket instead of nothing, which is, I'm afraid, the alternative. Walter looked at the man and then at the folder, and then out at the corn, his father's corn, and he did not say anything for a long moment. "My family's farmed this land 110 years, he said at last. It was the only argument he had, and he knew as he said it that it was no argument at all, that it meant nothing to the columns in the folder. That sentiment was not a currency the institution accepted. "I understand it's difficult," Vance said, in a tone that understood nothing. He knew the buyer. Everyone in Halford knew. There was an agricultural holding company buying up failing family farms across 3 counties, paying cents on the dollar, consolidating the land into one vast operation run by no one who lived there. Vance was their man or their man's man, the polite blade they sent ahead. He had foreclosed on the Petersons in the spring and the Kowalskis the summer before that, and he had a reputation in town as a man who smiled while he did it. He smiled now, a small, economical smile that did not reach his eyes. "Think it over," he said, "but not for too long. The window closes whether you decide or not." He left a card on the hood of Walter's truck, weighted down with a stone so the wind would not take it, and he drove away in his gun-colored car, and the dust he raised hung gray in the cold October light. Walter stood in his yard for a long time after the sedan was gone. The corn stood brown around him more than he could ever bring in alone, the slipping clutch in the combine a death sentence dressed as a machine. He was 71. His wife was in the churchyard on the hill. His son was on the coast, and would tell him to take the money, sell, move into town, be sensible, the way the young are always sensible about the things that are not theirs to lose, and a man in a suit had just told him that the only thing he had left the land that held his whole bloodline was going to be taken in a matter of weeks. He did not call his son. He did not call anyone. He went into the kitchen where Eleanor was nowhere and everywhere, where her apron still hung on the hook by the door because he had never been able to take it down, and he sat at the table with the bank's first letter under the lamp, and he did the arithmetic again and again on the back of an envelope, and every time it came out the same. There was no version of the numbers where he kept the farm. The harvest, even fully brought in, even at a fair price, would not cover the balloon payment the new bank had structured into the note he had signed when he was desperate, and the old bank had still felt like family. He had been outmaneuvered by a contract he did not fully understand, written by men who understood it completely. That was the whole of it. That was how they took the land. Not with violence, with paper. He turned off the lamp and sat in the dark of the kitchen for a while longer. And he did not weep because he was past weeping by then. He had spent all of that in the spring, and what was left was just a tiredness so deep it had its own weight. Winter would have come and taken the farm in silence, if not for a phone call. Walter never made and never knew had been made for him. Dolores at the diner had a cousin, and the cousin tended bar at a roadhouse 2 states east. And the roadhouse was the kind of place where men in leather cuts drank. And one night that cousin mentioned, the way people mention things, the story of the old farmer back in Halford who had fed 30 stranded riders for free and paid his last dime to do it. It was a good story. People passed it along. And it reached by a path no one planned, the ears of a man named Briggs, who set down his glass when he heard it and asked the bartender to tell it again, slower, and who already knew it because he had lived it, and who had been wondering all year how a man like Walter Brandt had fared since. The Iron Covenant was a real club, a regional fellowship that had nothing to do with the larger and more famous outfits whose names made the news. But they rode the same roads, and they kept the same kind of code, and that code had one rule above all the others. A debt was a debt, not a debt of money. Money was the smallest thing a man could owe. A debt of the other kind, the kind Walter had created in a cinder-block diner on Route 9 without meaning to, without wanting anything back. That kind of debt did not expire, and did not discount, and did not care what a bank's calendar said. Briggs had carried it for a year. And when he heard, through the long grapevine of the road, that the old man who fed his brothers was about to lose everything to a suit with a folder, he made some calls of his own. 3 days before Vance's foreclosure window was set to close, Walter woke to the engines. He came out onto the porch with his cold coffee, and he watched the river of chrome flood his yard. More than 30 bikes, the same winged skull cuts, and at the front of them all a heavy-set man with a gray-streaked beard climbing off his machine. Walter's heart hammered. He did not recognize Briggs at first, a year older and the morning light hard in his eyes. And for one long, terrible moment he believed the worst, because a lifetime of stories tells you that 30 bikers in your yard at dawn is not a thing that ends well. Then Briggs took off his sunglasses, and he looked up at the old man on the porch, and something in the hard face shifted. "You fed my brothers," Briggs said, the gravel rumble carried across the still yard, "when you had nothing." "You think we forgot?" Walter could not speak. The coffee mug trembled in his hand. He set it down on the railing. "We heard about the bank," Briggs said. He came up the porch steps slow, his boots heavy on the old wood, and he stopped in front of Walter, and he did not offer soft words then, either. He looked out at the standing corn, brown and ready and far too much for one man, and he understood the whole situation in a single sweep of his reading eyes. "How much of this needs to come in?" "All of it," Walter managed. "And it won't matter. The bank's taking it regardless. There's a payment I can't make, harvest or no harvest." Briggs was quiet for a moment. Behind him, in the yard, 30-some riders stood beside their bikes, waiting, watching their leader with the stillness of men who would move the instant he told them to and not 1 second before. "2 problems, then," Briggs said. "The corn and the suit." He turned and looked back at his men, and he raised one hand, and the yard came alive. "We can do something about both. What happened over the next 3 days, the people of Halford would talk about for years. 36 men of the Iron Covenant, men who looked like the answer to a nightmare, descended on Walter Brandt's 420 acres, and they worked. They were not all farmers, but enough of them had grown up on land like this, and the rest learned fast and worked harder to make up for what they did not know. They had brought trucks behind the bikes, flatbeds, and a grain hauler, and they had brought a mechanic named Otis, who took one look at the slipping clutch in Walter's combine and had it pulled apart on a tarp in a yard before the dew had burned off. Otis was a wide, slow-moving man with grease worked so deep into his knuckles that no soap would ever reach it, and he did not say much, but he hummed while he worked, some old tune with no name Walter could place. By noon of the first day he had the clutch rebuilt and the machine back together, and he wiped his hands and climbed down and said, "Only, she'll hold now. Take her easy on the turns." The machine that had been dying ran like it was new. Walter stood in his own field and listened to it run, the clean, even pull of an engine doing what it was built to do. And he had to walk to the tree line twice, so no one would see an old man weep. They worked from before dawn to after dark. The corn came down in long, clean rows, the combine chewing steady through the standing brown while men walked the field edges pulling what the machine could not reach, and the grain hauler filled load by load. They slept in the barn and in tents in the yard, and they cooked over fires built in a ring of stones. One of them laid the first night, and the smell of wood smoke and frying meat drifted up to the house in a way the house had not smelled in years. On the second night, Briggs sat with Walter on the porch, and they did not talk much, the way they had not talked much in the diner. Two men comfortable in the kind of silence that does not need filling. Below them in the yard the fires burned low, and the men's voices came up in fragments. A laugh, a name called, the soft scrape of a whetstone on a blade. Somebody was sharpening for no reason but the doing of it. The sergeant-at-arms of the chapter was a lean, scarred man named Roan, hard-eyed and economical with words, who had watched Walter all the first day the way a guard dog watches a stranger, and had decided somewhere in the watching that the old man was sound. He was not a man who warmed easily or quickly. He had a long, pale scar that ran from the corner of one eye down into his beard, and a habit of standing a little apart from the others at the edge of the firelight where he could see the road. On the second evening, Roan brought Walter a plate of food without a word, set it in his hands, and stood there a moment while Walter took the first bite, as though confirming the old man would eat. Then he nodded once and went back to his place at the edge of the light. That was all, and from Roan that was everything. And Walter understood it for what it was, the way you understand. A language you did not know, you spoke. But the corn was only half the debt, and Briggs had not forgotten the other half. On the morning of the third day, with the fields nearly cleared and the grain hauler filling, a German sedan the color of a gun turned off the county road and came up the gravel drive, and Garrett Vance got out in his polished shoes and his expensive suit, and he stopped cold at the sight of 36 motorcycles parked in formation across the yard. To his credit, Vance did not run. He had the institutional confidence of a man who had never once in his career met a situation his bank could not buy or bury, and he walked toward the porch with his folder under his arm as though the leather-clad men flanking him on every side were so much scenery. "Mr. Brandt," he called out, "I see you found some seasonal labor. It won't change the arithmetic. The payment is due in 2 days, and you cannot make it. I've come to discuss the terms of an orderly surrender." He reached the foot of the porch steps, and only then did he seem to register Briggs, standing beside Walter with his arms crossed, and the registering changed nothing in his face, because Vance did not yet understand what he had walked into. Briggs came down the steps. He did not raise his voice. He never once in the whole of what followed raised his voice. "What's the number?" he said. Vance blinked. "I'm sorry. The number. The payment he can't make. What is it?" Vance recovered his smile, the smile he wore foreclosing on the Petersons and the Kowalskis. "I'm afraid that's confidential financial information between the institution and the borrower. And frankly, friend, it's not the sort of sum a gentleman such as yourself carries in his vest." He let the contempt show, then just a flash of it, the wealthy man's certainty that leather and chrome meant poverty, and that poverty meant powerlessness. It was the single worst miscalculation of Garrett Vance's career, and he made it standing in a yard surrounded by men whose entire code was built on the difference between what a thing looks like and what it is. There was a younger member of the chapter, a quiet writer named Eli, who never went anywhere without a battered laptop in a waterproof case, and whom the others called the Ledger, because he kept the chapter's books and because he had a particular gift for the kind of numbers that lived in other people's computers. Eli had spent the 2 days of harvest doing something other than cutting corn. Briggs had set him to it the first morning, and now Briggs simply said, "Eli," and the young man came forward with his laptop already open. "Alford Agricultural Holdings," Eli said, reading from the screen in a flat, unhurried voice. "The buyer? Mr. Vance keeps lining up for these parcels registered in Delaware, but you follow the ownership up through 3 shell companies, and you land on a private equity fund. And the fund's regional acquisition officer, the man who signs off on every distressed farm purchase in this part of the state, is a fellow named Garrett Vance." He looked up. "Same Garrett Vance. And the bank pays you to declare these farms in default. The fund pays you to buy them at the bottom. You're on both sides of every one of these deals, Mr. Vance. That's not asset management. That's a man robbing his own employer's customers and pocketing the spread." The yard had gone very still. Vance's smile was the last thing to die. "That's a serious accusation," he said, but the institutional confidence had cracked, and underneath it was the sound Walter had been waiting a year to hear. The sound of a powerful man discovering that his power was made of paper, and the paper was on fire. "You can't prove a word of it." "We can prove all of it," Eli said. "The Petersons, the Kowalskis, 11 farms across 3 counties, every one of them flagged by you, every one of them bought by a fund you secretly own a piece of. It's documented. The wire transfers, the email chains, the timestamps. It's already copied to 4 places you can't reach." He closed the laptop. "Your employer doesn't know yet. The families you took the land from don't know yet. But that's a temporary condition, Mr. Vance. It changes the moment Mr. Brandt decides it changes." Briggs stepped forward then, and he stood close to Vance, close enough that the suited man had to tilt his head up to meet the biker's eyes, and the formation of riders behind them did not move and did not need to. "Here's how this goes," Briggs said, low and even. "You are going to mark that note paid. Today, the whole balance. You've got the authority. We know you do. You've used it to wipe debts for buyers you favored a dozen times. You're going to use it now." He let that sit. "You are going to leave this man's land, and you are never going to set foot on it again. And you are going to spend the rest of your career waiting to find out whether the day has come that Mr. Brandt picks up a phone. Because everything Eli found stays right where it is. In those 4 places you can't reach, and it stays quiet exactly as long as this old man keeps his farm and his peace. The moment he doesn't, it all comes out at once." Vance's hands were shaking now. The folder slipped from under his arm, and the papers scattered across the gravel, his whole arithmetic blown loose in the wind, and no one bent to help him gather it. "You're threatening a federal banking officer." He tried, but the words came out thin. The voice of a man reciting a spell he has just discovered does not work. "No," Briggs said. "Threatening would be telling you what happens to a man who robs widows and old farmers and gets caught. We're not telling you that. We're offering you the one way out you don't deserve. Take it." Walter watched it happen from the porch. He watched Garrett Vance, who had stood in this same yard in October and looked at the corn like a butcher looks at a steer, kneel down in his expensive suit on the gravel of a farm he had come to steal, and gather his scattered papers with shaking hands, and stand, and look once at the wall of leather and chrome around him, and understand, at last and completely, that there was no buying and no burying his way out. He took out his phone. He made a call. His voice was barely above a whisper as he gave the instructions. the authorization codes, the account numbers, marking the Brant note paid in full, while 3 dozen men watched him do it. When it was done, he did not say a word to Walter. He could not look at him. He walked back to his gun-colored car through a yard that opened just enough to let him pass, and he drove away into the flat, hard light of mid-morning, and the dust he raised hung behind him, and no one in that yard ever saw Garrett Vance again. The fields were clear by sundown. The grain was in the holler, and the holler was full, and the rebuilt combine sat quiet at the edge of the last cut row, and Walter Brant owned his farm free and clear for the first time in a decade. He stood in the doorway of his barn as the light went orange and then red, and then gone, and he watched the men of the Iron Covenant move around their fires in the yard, and he did not have the words for what was in his chest. Briggs found him there. The big man came and stood beside him in the barn door, and they looked out at the fires together. "You didn't have to do any of this," Walter said finally. "No," Briggs agreed. "We didn't." He was quiet a moment. "That's what makes it count." He pulled something from inside his cut, a small thing, and pressed it into Walter's hand. It was a patch, the winged skull, smaller than the ones the men wore on their backs, the kind a club gives to someone who is not a member and never will be, but who belongs to them now all the same, who is theirs to look after. "Anybody comes at this farm again," Briggs said. "Anybody, bank, a buyer, a man in a suit, you call the number on the back of that. Doesn't matter the hour, doesn't matter the state we're in, we'll come." He looked at Walter, and the hard face was soft, only in the eyes. "You answered the question right, old man. Now we answer it back." They rode out the next morning the way they had come, the engines building from the yard and rolling down the gravel and out onto the county road, 36 riders 2 abreast, the thunder fading slow this time, fading the right way, fading like something that had finished what it came to do. Walter stood on his porch and watched them go until the last of the sound was gone, and the only thing left was the wind moving through the stubble of his cleared fields. He held the small patch in his hand. He turned it over. There was a phone number inked on the back in careful block letters, and below it, in the same hand, 3 words: "The debt's paid." The winter that came was the first easy winter Walter had known since Eleanor died. The note was gone. The land was his. He hung the small winged skull patch on a nail in the kitchen, beside the window where the morning light came in the room that had been so silent for so long, and the silence in that room was different. Now was not empty the way it had been, was the silence of a man at peace instead of the silence of a man alone. He cooked again. He had not cooked a real meal since the spring of the year Eleanor passed, and one cold morning in December he found himself standing at the stove with eggs going in the pan and the radio on low. And he understood that the part of him that had died with his wife had not died after all, had only been waiting, the way a field waits under snow. He drove to the diner on Route 9 that same morning, and he took the corner booth, and Dolores brought his coffee without being asked, and she sat down across from him for a minute the way she never used to, and she said she had heard, everyone had heard, about the bikers and the bank man and the harvest. Halford was a small town, and a story like that did not stay quiet. Walter did not tell her all of it. He did not tell her about Eli and the laptop and the 11 farms and the 4 places Vance could not reach. Some debts are paid in silence and stay paid only in silence, and Walter understood that as well as any man in the Iron Covenant did. He just drank his coffee and watched the road, the way he always had, except now when a low thunder built somewhere out on the highway, his heart did not clench with dread. It lifted, because he knew now what that sound could mean. He knew there were men in the world who remembered a kindness for a year and rode 3 states to repay it, and who had told an old farmer in a barn door that he was theirs to look after, and who did not say things like that and not mean them. Spring came, and with it, the planting, and Walter Brandt was 72 now, and his knees were no better. But the combine ran clean, and the clutch held, and the note was a thing of the past. He planted the same fields his father and grandfather had planted. He fed the birds that came to the cleared rows, and on the mornings the loneliness still found him, because grief does not leave a man, it only learns to sit quieter beside him. He would go to the nail by the kitchen window and take down the small patch and turn it over in his hands and read the 3 words inked there. And he would think of a question his wife used to ask about a hungry man at the door. And he would know that he had answered it right, and that somewhere out on the long roads of the country, a debt that was not made of money had come all the way home. If this story warms something in you, if you believe a kindness given freely finds its way back, take a moment to let the people who made it know. Leave a word below about the kindness that came back to you when you least expected it. And if stories of loyalty, kept against all the odds, are the kind you want to keep finding, stay close, because there are more of them waiting, and every one of them is true to the same code Walter learned in a cinder-block diner on a cold autumn morning, that you feed the hungry man at your door and you trust the road to remember.